The morning sun rose over the wide plains, casting long, golden streaks across the weathered wood of Caleb Mercer's ranch house. Dust swirled along the dirt paths, catching in the light like tiny sparks. Caleb sat on the porch, hat low over his brow, boots propped on the railing, staring out at the horizon as if the earth itself might offer answers. A letter lay open beside him, its edges creased and ink smudged from hurried hands. "My father," 3 times a day, the words scrawled in a shaky hand. He read them again, slowly, letting the weight of each word sink in. The handwriting belonged to Emily, a girl he had seen only once in passing at the town's small general store. Her life had been whispered about in quiet tones, her father's drinking, the way he terrorized the small household, the fear she carried in her eyes every time someone spoke too loudly. But this letter was different. It was raw, desperate, and unflinching. She had written to him specifically because she had nowhere else to turn, hoping someone strong and principled would intervene. Caleb's jaw tightened as he imagined her tiny shoulders carrying burdens far too heavy for a child. He had never been one to meddle in others' affairs. The townsfolk called him a loner, a man content with cattle, fences, and the silence of his land. But this was different. Emily's plea was a spark that lit something in him he hadn't felt in years. He could picture her at the edge of that tumble-down cabin, keeping her back straight, hands folded, waiting for disaster to strike, always bracing for it, and it made his chest ache. Caleb rose slowly, his movements deliberate. He ran a hand over the brim of his hat, then over the rough leather of his saddlebag. Inside, he packed water, a simple first aid kit, and blankets. The ranch stretched wide and empty behind him, quiet except for the low moan of wind through the fence posts. His horses shifted in their stalls, sensing his purpose. By mid-morning, Caleb had mounted his best horse, the animal snorting and stamping against the sun-warmed ground. Dust rose in spirals as he rode toward the neighboring homestead, each hoofbeat a drum of determination across the open plains. The journey took him past rolling hills, scrubby sagebrush, and a lone windmill turning lazily against the blue sky. His mind was focused not on the miles ahead but on the people waiting at the end of the trail, Emily and her father, a girl trapped by circumstance and a man enslaved to his own vices. When Caleb reached the cabin, the scene confirmed his worst fears. The small wooden structure leaned unevenly against the wind, paint peeling, windows streaked with grime. Inside, the father lay slumped in a chair, whiskey bottles scattered across the floor, his face red and expression vacant. Emily stood near the corner, clutching a tattered blanket around her shoulders, her eyes wide, scanning every movement with quiet terror. Caleb dismounted, boots crunching against gravel, and stepped toward the doorway. The father barely noticed him, muttering incoherently, while Emily's gaze flicked to him with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Caleb Mercer, a man known for his silence, took a deep breath and spoke firmly, his voice cutting through the stale air of the cabin. "I'm here to help," he said, and for the first time, Emily dared to believe. The rancher's presence alone shifted the balance in the room. It was not loud or threatening, just steady, unyielding, and resolute, the kind of authority that commanded respect without raising a hand. He looked from the father to Emily, then back again, and made a quiet promise to himself. This household would change before nightfall. Caleb didn't wait for the father to sober up or for the town to notice. That afternoon, the rain began in soft sheets, drumming against the thin roof of the cabin and sliding down the cracked windows in shimmering streams. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and stale whiskey, but beneath it all was the faint scent of Emily's effort, fresh bread and tea left cooling on the table, the small comforts she had managed despite the chaos surrounding her. Caleb stepped into the kitchen without hesitation, boots thudding against the warped floorboards, and found Emily tending to the father as best she could. The man was slumped against the chair again, face pale and lips cracked, shaking slightly as the last of his whiskey ran dry. Emily moved like a shadow, leaning over him to place a damp cloth on his forehead, muttering words of encouragement that barely reached Caleb's ears. Her small hands trembled slightly as she brushed his hair back from his brow, the tension in her shoulders visible in every movement. She was trying to hold together what the man's recklessness had torn apart, and it struck Caleb like a physical blow. He knelt beside her and the man, carefully examining the father's condition. Cuts from past falls, bruises from missteps, and the deep lines of chronic illness marked the man's skin. Caleb noticed immediately that if left alone, the father's routine of drink and neglect would slowly destroy him. He took a damp cloth from the table, wrung it out, and gently placed it on the father's shoulder. "He needs water," Caleb said firmly. And food. Nothing else. Emily looked up, her eyes wide and grateful, but she also seemed unsure whether she had the right to accept this intervention. Caleb gave her a small nod, reassuring her silently. I've seen enough of men destroying themselves, he continued, voice quiet but steady. This stops now. The father groaned and tried to swat Caleb's hands away, reaching blindly for the nearest bottle. Caleb's presence was calm but unyielding. He pushed the bottle aside and placed a steady hand on the man's chest, forcing him to sit upright. Drink this instead, Caleb instructed, handing over a cup of water. The father blinked, confused and half angry, but Caleb held his gaze until he drank. Emily watched the entire interaction, silent tears gathering in her eyes. For years, she had carried the burden of her father's neglect alone. Now, here was someone strong enough to confront it without raising a fist, someone who refused to let the cycle continue. She dared to hope that he might be healed, that she might finally have some peace. Caleb moved swiftly, preparing a simple meal from the provisions he had brought along, setting the table carefully and making sure the father was seated properly. He adjusted blankets around the girl, checking that her shoulders were dry from the rain. He did not lecture, he did not scold. Every motion was deliberate, efficient, and protective. Hours passed as Caleb stayed, guiding Emily through small tasks she could handle while he attended to her father's needs. By the time the sun broke through the clouds again, lighting the cabin with a golden glow, the atmosphere inside had shifted. Fear and tension gave way to something steadier. Emily sat quietly, sipping tea, glancing at Caleb with a mixture of awe and relief. The father, still groggy and resistant, began to settle into a rhythm he hadn't known in years, guided not by fear but by Caleb's quiet authority. Outside, the rain had washed the dust from the prairie, leaving the world fresh and alive. Inside, the cabin felt lighter, warmer, safer. For Emily, it was the first time in memory that she could breathe without bracing for disaster. And Caleb Mercer, the lone rancher, knew he had just begun a task that would change all of their lives forever. The next morning, the prairie stretched wide beneath a pale golden sky, dew glinting on the sagebrush and fence posts. Caleb Mercer rode out before dawn, Li Wei's absence replaced by the quiet determination of purpose. No one in Red Hollow expected him to intervene in a neighbor's household beyond the occasional glance or passing advice, but this time was different. The town was used to whispers, not action, and Caleb intended to make his presence, and his message, impossible to ignore. He arrived at the ramshackle cabin as the sun climbed higher, dust motes dancing in the light streaming through the cracks in the walls. Emily was already awake, kneeling beside the small hearth, tidying what little could be organized in the chaos her father had left behind. She froze when she saw Caleb dismount, but relief flickered across her features almost instantly. She knew this man didn't act without reason, and if he had come, it meant change was coming. Inside, the father stirred, blinking against the morning light, hands shaking as he reached for his whiskey bottle. Caleb's boots echoed against the worn floor as he stepped forward, eyes fixed on the man. No, he said quietly but firmly, the single word carrying the weight of a law no one dared defy. The father's hand froze midair. Caleb's gaze did not waver. You will drink nothing but water until you are healed, and you will eat what she prepares. Do you understand? The man grumbled, muttering protests and excuses, but Caleb did not relent. Emily watched from the corner, hands gripping the edge of the table. For years, she had tiptoed through her father's chaos, holding herself together while he unraveled. Now, she dared to hope, and Caleb's calm authority made that hope tangible. Over the next hours, Caleb set a routine, moving with quiet precision. He guided Emily as she prepared breakfast, showing her small but crucial ways to care for her father without losing herself. He cleaned wounds, ensured the father drank water, and adjusted blankets to keep him warm. At every step, his presence was firm, protective, and unwavering. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten, he simply took control of the situation, creating order from years of neglect. When the father resisted, Caleb stayed calm. When he tried to slur excuses, Caleb responded with patience backed by unshakable authority. He never lost sight of Emily, who began to mimic his quiet command, gaining confidence with every instruction she followed. By mid-afternoon, the father's movements were steadier, the tremor in his hands less pronounced. His eyes, though still wary, tracked Caleb with a new understanding. This man would not allow harm to continue unchecked. By the time Caleb prepared to leave, the household was transformed. Emily's face held a smile she had not known in years, tentative but genuine. Her father, though far from cured, was calmer, seated at the table with a bowl of porridge and a cup of water, guided by the rancher's earlier intervention. Outside, the prairie glimmered in the late sun, wind moving through tall grass in gentle waves. Caleb mounted his horse, tipping his hat to Emily with a nod. "Stay strong," he said. She nodded back, a mix of gratitude and newfound courage shining in her eyes. The rancher rode off across the plains, leaving behind a household that would never be the same. Word of his deed spread quickly through Red Hollow. People whispered in awe of the lone rancher who had entered a home ruled by fear and neglect and restored hope through quiet authority and steadfast care. The region learned something that day: courage and compassion could carry the weight of justice. Caleb Mercer had shown that sometimes, the strength of a man was measured not by the gun he carried, but by the lives he chose to protect. And Emily, finally, could breathe freely for the first time in years.